Good evening and welcome. We're just waiting on one of the team who's gone to collect something for Michael and Terry, who will be back in a few minutes. So in the meantime, welcome everyone to this yet another wonderful event connected with One Book New Canaan. Really thrilled to have you all here, and I'm glad we've got such a great turnout. Thank you to those of you who've been coming to lots of different events. I see various people in the audience who I've seen at a few other events. Sorry. And wow. And so that you know, in this final week of One Book New Canaan 2015, we have a number of really fun events on. So starting the week with this one, then we have on Wednesday the Speakeasy. So this room will be transformed into a circa 1927 gin house. So it'll be dark and dingy. We'll have silent pictures on the screen. We've got jazz musicians coming to play live. We've got wine tastings, signature cocktails, food. It should be a really fun event. So please do turn up on Wednesday evening for the Speakeasy. And then finally, our culminating event this year is a play. So we've had a play written specifically taken from the text of Bill Bryson's work, turned into a play called The Murder and Booze Cabaret. It's on at the Powerhouse Theater, 2 showings, 6 and 8 on Saturday night. You do need to register, but it's free, and you can register on the website or upstairs at the information desk. As I say, an original work produced from the Bill Bryson book. We're really excited about this. The first time we have done a text-to-stage, page-to-stage production here. And this year's One Book New Canaan has been an overwhelming success, so we're really pleased about how it's gone. So it looks like we might be ready. I am just so very pleased to welcome the Dinan brothers. So my good friend Michael has been running New Canaanite for about a year? Yep. About a year now. And he and Terry both work on New Canaanite. Terry is a local historian as well, who writes the 0684 Old column, so the local history column that you see in the New Canaanite. Terry, a 30-year resident of New Canaan, also is employed by the History Channel, so history is his thing through and through, New Canaan history particularly. And we're just really, really excited to spend the next hour or so learning all about what was happening in 1927 here in New Canaan. Thanks.
All right. Great. Well, thank you guys so much for coming. Hope everybody's enjoying their spring, such as it is. Actually, I should have thought of this. Just occurred to me, we probably should have done average temperature of 1927 and compared it with today, average snowfall. But yeah, we didn't want to rub it in. We'll do it for the next one.
Do it for the next one.
Yeah. So first of all, just wanted to say thank you so much for the New Canaan Library for asking us to speak this evening. And just a quick word about who we are. We grew up here, quite literally we grew up here. We attended Center School right across the street, and I see a couple of my friends' parents in the audience, which is great. Part of the reason why we came back to New Canaan. But Mike and I, we just walk to town, go to Mackenzie's and Breslow's, and buy candy and smuggle it into the library, and just spend our afternoons on a sugar high, but reading books, watching movies, doing homework, hanging out with friends until our mom, who was a teacher at Center School and East School for 35 years, would come and pick us up. So this was essentially a safe haven for us as kids. And as a parent and adult now, I do have a newfound appreciation for the library, not just watching my own kids enjoy it, but also utilizing it for research, for leisure, for events like this that celebrate the wonderful town that we live in. So we're very flattered and honored to be here, and for us it brings things pretty much full circle. So we'd also like to thank the Historical Society, specifically Janet Lindstrom. Janet's in the back right there. and just thank her for the treasure trove of photos, many of which you'll see. You can see some of them here, many of which you'll see during our presentation, and the amount of research materials. It's an invaluable resource, and it's more than just a repository for the pictures and the books. It's a living, breathing museum, and again, another wonderful institution in this town. So just a quick round of applause for the library and the Historical Society. So our hope tonight is that we can accomplish an overview of 1927. We're going to be kind of zooming in, zooming out, and jumping from topic to topic. Hang on one second. There we go. So anyway, 1927 was a very important time in our town. It was a time of transition, a time of evolution in technology, in business, education, sports, and just life in general. We'll show visuals of that period, thanks again to the Historical Society, and thanks to several New Canaan families that are generations old.
Some of them are here, the Carls, I saw the Stewarts.
We poured through newspaper records at the Historical Society. We looked at maps and aerials and postcards of old buildings, some of which are gone, like Center School, some of which are still here. People talk about New Canaan's Rockwellian charm, and in my opinion, this was the period right here in the 20s when that was established. And as documented in Bryson's book, it was a milestone year for the country and for New Canaan. New Canaan was certainly no exception. Okay, so New Canaan is growing. Population of the town at the beginning of 1927 was pegged at 4,069. That was up 69 people since 1924. In the 1920s, the population grew from 3,895 in 1920 to 5,431 in 1930. So it was a pretty large percentage. It sounds like a small number, but the actual percentage was very high. It was actually a 40% increase. Mary Louise King notes in Portrait of New Canaan that commuters to New York City then represented nearly half the working male population. From the first advertiser of 1927, I'm reading a quote here. New Year came to New Canaan without any general celebration, although there were numerous house parties. No public dance was held in any of the halls in town. A watch meeting was held in the Methodist Episcopal Church with a devotional service at midnight. A very few celebrators were on the street when midnight tolled from the clock in the Congregational Church. Those who were abroad blew horns, and a few revolver shots were heard. In the distance could be heard whistles blowing in Stamford and Norwalk, and even as far away as Bridgeport. A whistle in Norwalk did real well, tooting from 12 o'clock until almost 12:30. Matters of public interest that were discussed at a public meeting in the opening days of 1927 included, quote, that a board of health be established, that a body of men and women competent to advise be appointed with whom the prospective builders might confer regarding their buildings, placing trees and shrubbery on their properties, and on similar questions. Another had to do with the municipal collection of garbage, and another on the neglected cemeteries in town. And that was from the January 6th New Canaan Advertiser. Do we have
This.
Oh yeah, here. So for this particular ad, the small print reads, "We of New Canaan pride ourselves upon the features which make this among the best towns of suburban New York. We realize the conditions which have attracted so many persons to our community, which have proved a magnet
We had to switch to a different computer because we had a technical difficulty with the projector. Sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. We realize the conditions which have attracted so many persons to our community which have proved a magnet to individuals of culture and refinement. New Canaan is a good town in which to live. There is none better. Our town will continue to grow, to prosper, and to retain all its characteristics which are so favorably known. We, the businessmen of New Canaan, will do all that is in our power to help New Canaan. Okay, so as I mentioned before, New Canaan was in a transitionary state. It had evolved from an industrial town, a shoemaking town, to a residential town with the ridges filling out. There were lots of changes and developments as large estates were subdivided into smaller lots. It's a familiar refrain, I'm sure, if you've been following local news lately. Downtown, you can see on the map to the right, it hasn't really changed too much. I mean, it's a cluster of streets and with new businesses popping up. So where there were once shoe manufacturing establishments, it evolved into more of a community with new businesses such as markets and other stores that are catered to local residents instead of the masses. So this map was found inside a 1927 New Canaan Darien directory by the Historical Society of Researchers. And as I said before, you know, very similar to how it is today with the railroad feeding the downtown. As you kind of spread out, as it kind of spider web cracks out, obviously it's similar to today in terms of wide open spaces, but it's certainly a little bit different these days. But there was an influx of people coming to town. There were former summer residents that were actually making New Canaan a permanent home, and that contributed to the population increase that I spoke about before. So here we zoom in on downtown in 1927. Mead Park is established but not quite yet developed. There's no Pine Street. Cherry Street ends at Main. It did not continue until all the way over to Locust Avenue until the 70s, but that's Baldwin Avenue that ran up until Burtis, and then Burtis circled right up to Main Street. Elm Street significantly was called Railroad Avenue. It did not change until to Elm Street until the 30s. And then the photo, lower right corner, that's of Main Street at about East Avenue. It's in 1918, but it kind of gives you a sense of Main Street. Is that the Armistice?
No, that's not. That's
Okay.
one from Steve.
Okay, yeah, so it just gives you a sense that Main Street, you know, truly was a main street. This is excavation of Main Street, laying down pipes, and ultimately paving it as the age of the auto boomed in town. You might recognize some of these buildings in the lower right-hand corner. This is Main Street looking north, almost across the street, a little bit further up. The one-story building right there is currently houses Blue Mercury. The multi-storied building right there is what's known as the Raymond Building. It has sort of a modern facade on it right now. But if you look through the facade, you can see a sign that actually says Raymond Building on it. And the Raymond Building had stores on the bottom and a banquet reception hall on the second floor that was also used as a church. Yeah, this is, yeah, those who do not know history are doomed to repeat it. So the post office was on Main Street. So this was actually in the Raymond Building. This was on the ground floor of the Raymond Building. And so this is where the post office was located until about 1930. So again, just to underscore the whole point of Main Street truly being a main street, Elm Street hadn't quite seen the development yet. Railroad Avenue hadn't seen the development yet, and Main Street truly was a main street with a post office. All right, Mike?
We're gonna talk more about some of these businesses that we're seeing in these photos in just a second. This is the intersection of Main Street and East Avenue. This is a composite of photos that Sid Greenberg put together that the Francos were kind enough to let us borrow. What we're looking at, if you look on the right there, it says Albert Franco in that building. That's what we've long have known as the Varnum's building right there. There was no alley to the right of it. Way on the left there, well, not way, but right here. This was Cody's drugstore. And I just wanted to, I thought it would be fun to break this out because there was a story that Carl Franco told me about his father, Dick Franco. Dick Franco's a local guy, class of 39, New Canaan High School, classmate of Steve Banco's dad. Steve's here.
With his yearbook.
With his yearbook. Steve ended up in the first grade at St. A's with Rick Franco, so something went wrong there. But as a boy, Dick heard about this traffic light. It's said that this was the first traffic light in New Canaan, and he asked his mother to take him to see it, so she did, and she held his hand, and he watched it change a couple times, and I guess they went home. But this really is an example of Main Street, and Terry said, as the hub of the downtown. Even with businesses that we've long come to associate with Elm Street, like Franco's. In fact, one of the businesses we see here, and we're going to get into this a little later, was an anchor business and really sort of a pioneering commercial enterprise for Elm Street, which, as Terry said, was known for obvious reasons as Railroad Avenue.
Okay, here's the Armistice Day. This is the photo we see at the top is from November 11th, 1918. It's looking up Main Street from about East Avenue, and so this is right at the end of the First World War. And it's not just a very rare and wonderful photo from the Francos, but it's also relevant here because the 20s saw some landmarks of our town installed. Physical touchstones that we know today, and they include two from 1923, and one of them is the Wayside Cross. Historical Society photo on the lower right, and that's the unveiling of the Wayside Cross, which was dedicated on September 9th, 1923. It's at the bottom of God's Acre, where we mark Veterans Day today. And where service people salute each year in the Memorial Day Parade. The cross was designed by Francis Adams Kent, who is a student of Gutzon Borglum, the architect and sculptor famous for Mount Rushmore. There were 2,000 civilians on hand, which is, at that time, a pretty big chunk of the population in town. It was meant to be erected right after World War I, but there was actually no funding. New Canaan was in a slight depression right after the war ended. All right. So a big part of the book was Babe Ruth. 1923, we'll dial it back a couple years, at the time that the Wayside Cross was being dedicated, another monument, if you will, was being dedicated. It was Yankee Stadium, actually opened in April of 1923. Not coincidentally, but quite appropriately, Babe Ruth hit a home run against the Boston Red Sox on opening day at Yankee Stadium, and his former team. Obviously, 1927 was a big year for Ruth. He hit 60 home runs that year. And then, and there's the newspaper article that captures the moment for New Canaan.
Okay, we're going to get back to some of those businesses. Walter Stewart's, the photo you see in the lower right there is Walter Stewart, the original, with Nellie Stewart, his wife. Originally had been located at 107 Main Street. That's, I'm told by Doug and Alex, is roughly opposite Town Hall, okay? The photo of Walter Stewart you see here, and if you go to the municipal meetings, that's at the very bottom of Elm Street on Main Street. That was the location that Stewart's moved to in the 40s and 50s, Okay, so for 1927, they weren't there just yet, but they would go up to the current location that we know after they were on this part of Main Street.
And that building no longer exists. The bank that you can see barely to the right, I believe expanded over the footprint of that. And so that.
Yeah, Chase. The Stewarts were kind enough to lend us the meeting minutes from their board of directors and annual stockholders meetings from 1927. It was really interesting. There's a note, and this is, you see some of the writing here. These are some of the notes from their meetings, from the January 17th meeting about a second Stamford store. And the quote from the notes says, Mr. Walter Stewart explained that he was doing all in his power to unload the Stamford store. But he was tied up with a lease for 8 months more, which made it very difficult to do. A few months later, on the May 19th Board of Directors meeting, another note regarding Stamford, it says, quote, in regard to Stamford, Mr. Walter Stewart said he could get a double store on Grey Rock Place at $80 a month to start, and later $125 on a 5-year lease. Grey Rock Place is where the mall is, if you know Stamford. And then I thought this was sort of poignant, and I'm gonna spend another slide on this. At the annual meeting of stockholders, which was in January of 1927, part of the notes read, quote, the amount of business for 1926 was approximately the same, something keeps popping up in my face here, as 1925. But the large increase in overhead caused the profit to be very much smaller than last year. The president, that's Walter Stewart, stated that there was a surplus of about $6,000 that could be used as dividends, but it was decided not to touch the same until the company is in better financial conditions. Yeah. I'm going to touch on something here and just take a moment to talk about Walter Stewart. This is a photo of him in the store, I believe, with his son. So that would be the father of many of the Stewarts we know, Bailey, Dick, and so on. We saw in the very first slide there was this Help New Canaan campaign, and that was a campaign that ran throughout 1927. It talked about how desirable it was to live here. It was something that was sponsored by local merchants, and we're going to see an example of that campaign again in just a few more slides. But I had an opportunity 2 years ago to interview the gentleman you see on the left here. It's Tommy Sirico. Many people here will know Tommy. He was born in 1922, April 1922, on Hoyt Street. He was a member of the Canaan High School class of 1942. He was a lifelong resident of the town. He would go on to enlist as a second-class petty officer in the Navy. During the Second World War, he ended up a gun captain in the Pacific. When I interviewed him 2 years ago for something else, but about his New Canaan experience, he was approaching his 91st birthday. And even then, he was driving himself to Dunkin' Donuts to hang out with John Buzzio and Lenny Paglialungo, and Tony. Tommy would pass about 6 months after our interview in the first part of 2013. But we were talking about the Depression in New Canaan, and I thought it was sort of poignant because when I went back to this with regards to Walter Stewart, we were talking about the Depression, and my question to Tommy, I have this all on audio, I said, who is someone important to New Canaan in your experience of the town here that people who moved in more recently may not know about? And his answer was Walter Stewart. He had a store there. It was down on Main Street, and then he moved it up to where they are now. Take poor people like me, my family. He wouldn't charge us for anything, for any of the food. He was a very good person. This is Tommy's quote. And I think, we'll go again, the next one. So the Stewarts have been civic-minded residents and business people here then and now. That's a tradition in New Canaan. As we look at these Help New Canaan campaign ads, you're going to see a number of businesses listed that supported the town in these very personal ways, and they include Walter Stewart, Carl Brothers, Whedon Duryea, many of the businesses that we know today. So Walter Stewart's wife was really remarkable, and pouring through the archives from the newspaper clippings in 1927, she's just all over the place. Nellie Stewart. Recall that New Canaan's population grew by almost 40% in the 1920s. One result of that was that the town picked up a second seat in the state legislature. In the fall of 1930, when the census data was confirmed, Nellie Stewart won election as a Republican to that seat. She was New Canaan's first woman representative. And it's remarkable. This was a decade after the 19th Amendment was ratified. And she was really ahead of her time. There's some family portraits here. So we see, is it Bob? Terry, the son? Okay. The final note is this home down here. This is sort of interesting. It's a 1900 built home on Hoyt Street. And Nellie and Walter purchased it in 1918, and it's been lived in continuously by the Stewart family for almost 100 years now. So he's an under-the-radar guy, but Alex and Susie are there with their family. I think that's kind of a cool thing about our town, too. Let me start this one. You start.
Okay. Lower right-hand side, the New Canaan Library. This is a 1936 photo from the Historical Society. Until 1913, it had been on the second floor of a building on the south side of Railroad Avenue, aka Elm Street. It was, the library bought this lot in 1910. Part of the problem with its Elm Street location had been proximity to the livery stables of an inn. The inn was the Birdsall House, and it was where Morse Court now stands. So more on that a little later. But they broke ground in 1913.
Familiar photo at the top there. Franco's started as a greengrocer on Main Street in the Varnum space. They opened sometime in the early 20s. The sort of patriarch of the family is Albert Franco, older brother of Dick Franco, who's father to Carl and Rick and the guys you all know from Elm Street. Starting stake of $55. They started with $500 and was there for a few years. Then moved up Railroad Avenue to the location we know today. It was really the first business to move up what we call Elm Street. It was either late 20s or early 30s, and it was a few years before anybody else, any other business person would venture to go up to the boondocks up there. People said he was crazy. It was seen as a move of significant risk, too far off the beaten track for a commercial district. Shouldn't do it. Next person after him to make the move was John Brotherhood and Higley, established. And actually it was those guys who talked Albert into buying property up there, so that worked out. Dick is the father of Rick. He was born in 1922, and he's the guy who graduated high school in 39. Next. Yep. Okay. So you can see this photo is after Prohibition was repealed through the 21st Amendment in 1933. The liquors on the left-hand side there. There are two separate entrances. That was a requirement. Even after Prohibition, you couldn't enter the same door to shop for groceries and liquor. What we're looking at, you can see the space on either side. I mean, there's no Silverberg building. You see Franco's really was sort of standing on its own. And we're looking at Albert on the way right. I don't know who's in the middle. That's Emo, is of the trio on the right-hand side. That's Emo, another brother on the left. And then this sort of rakish-looking guy, his name is Louis. Louis Franco had been born in 1909, 2 years after Albert. And he really deserves his own presentation from all the stories I heard from Rick. Franco's had 5 delivery trucks at this time. And I think this is probably a good time to start talking about Prohibition in New Canaan. Next. one of the keys to business then as now was to have big accounts. And the Francos had the Lapham family, right? They lived in what we call Waveney, and of course they had all those grounds of Waveney Park and what we know as the high school and Waveney Care Center and more. Waveney House on the left, that's an early photo from the Historical Society, was built in 1912. They carefully planned their grounds. That's a plan in the upper right from the Olmsted landscaping. People will recognize the name Frederick Law Olmsted, the Olmsted brothers firm laid out Waveney. If you've been following the news, you know Waveney is poised for listing on the National Register of Historic Places. It will be New Canaan's first public building to be so listed. That's recent. In any case, the oral tradition has it, and is Rick here? Rick Franco? Okay, it was Rick Franco who told me this. I can do that since he's not here. The way to keep these big accounts was to keep the kitchen staff in whiskey, and that's what was done. The most frequent arrest during Prohibition, we know from Mary Louise King, was bootlegging violations. A quote from her book, Portrait of New Canaan. Though saloons were closed, former bartenders brewed beer in their home kitchens. Grocery stores, for known customers, carried their, quote, private label brands of gin and Applejack. There was a cocktail made of mixing equal parts of Applejack, grapefruit juice, and maple syrup. You guys come back for the speakeasy this week. We're going to have some of that. Flasks and bottles were seen at private parties and dances. And as a result, sometimes the local police, but more often the state police, stopped trucks and raided the premises of those suspected of bootlegging. And they would get out and just continue. I mean, if you read the Bryson book, which I did, I hope you did, you know this is one of the most ineffective laws in the history of the United States. You know? New Canaan was no exception to that. It is interesting, too, that there's a distinction between the enforcement efforts of local and state police. Another little bird told me that our first ever police chief, Otto Schmidt, maybe kept his own still. This was not a local police force as we know it. It was 3 men, and Schmidt operated. Schmidt is pictured in that photo on the bottom. There are 3 figures in white, and then there's one in black right next to them under Fairdy's sign. That's Otto Schmidt. He lived in a second-floor apartment above Fairdy's Feed and Grain, which is where 125 Main Street is now, and that was our first police department. The police department would grow. Another quote from Mary Louise King, along with bootlegging came an increase in thefts and a large increase in juvenile delinquency. I won't say anything, Steve, about that. I had to talk with Steve Penko today. So that in the fall of 1926, the town offered the borough an annual contribution of $2,000 if they'd hire another policeman. New Canaan did, and in 1928 purchased its first patrol car and a police motorcycle. Another part of our oral tradition has to do with a speakeasy, which New Canaanites would frequent. New Canaan's own Jim Bach, who is one of the creators of the Gold Star Walk at Mead Park. And Jim, are you here? Jim, I think, is on the board at the Historical Society, too. He told me, all I can remember was my father, Jim's father is a New Canaanite, talking about how when he and his friends would get around Prohibition, there was a place up above Scott's Corners, in where Bedford has a park between Pound Ridge and Scott's Corners, and there was a speakeasy in there. And that was one of the places that New Canaanites would get their fix during Prohibition.
Okay, there's the Playhouse. Standing there as it does today. It was founded in 1923. The first movie that was shown there was Down to the Sea in Ships, with the great Clara Bow, the It Girl. You can see to the right.
Was she the It Girl who had the terrible voice? And so when
That's the one.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was I think it was a Brooklyn accent.
So when the talking
She was
pictures came in, she was no longer the it girl. She
Right.
was out.
The out girl. So a lot of forgotten stars off to the right. One who's not, and he's got the Beatles to thank for this, I think, is Tom Mix. Great cowboy star of the silent screen. Tom also is a bit of a pop culture icon because he's on the cover of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. He's one of the figures there. So when you go home, dig it out, dust it off, and look for Tom Mix. He's got the 10-gallon hat. Another big star in 1927, he made two big films, was John Barrymore. And obviously he came from a great acting family, along with his siblings Ethel and Lionel, and eventually his granddaughter Drew. He made two films in 27. One was Don Juan, and the other one was The Beloved Rogue. And playing young John Barrymore in the movie was a 2-year-old toddler named Dickie Moore. And I don't know if you guys remember Dickie Moore. He was in The Little Rascals as Dickie Moore. And he also married Jane Powell, a couple good claims to fame. Dickie Moore actually lives in Wilton, and he's one of the last surviving members of silent film. So Dickie Moore might have been shown, some of his movies might have been shown there. Certainly The Little Rascals, you would sometimes get double features at the Playhouse, along with a short. It could be a cartoon, it could be a short subject like The Little Rascals or Our Gang as it was known. And sometimes you got newsreels. And newsreels were one major way that locals got their news from outside of town.
The New Canaan Advertiser in 1927 acquired a building next door to the theater. I think it's still in the family. And it made sense. As Terry said, the movies had newsreels. It was another place where people went to get their news. But before we get into that, and specifically into how New Canaanites marked the transatlantic flight of Charles Lindbergh, which anchors the Bryson book, I want to note something I found very interesting in poring over these editions of the newspaper. This was really a lot of fun. And what really struck me was a certain literary quality in the writing, in reference and in form. Not only a literary quality in the writing of the news, but there was also a tendency to put ads and even news items, whenever possible, into rhyming couplets. It's something you never see today. So, for example, there's this news item will feel familiar. This is from the March 1927, a paper in March 1927. The headline is "Householders Must Care for Walks." The subhead is "Police to Notify Them After Snowstorms. Fine for infraction." And here's the item. Chief of Police Otto Schmidt and members of the police department will start a crusade against slippery walks after the next snowstorm. Local ordinances require that walks be cleared and made safe for pedestrians after each storm. Otherwise, the borough may do the work and charge it against the property owner abutting the walk which is cleared. And I look a little deeper into the paper, and kind of out of nowhere is this. If you want the cops to think you're nice, be sure and mix sand with your sidewalk ice. It wasn't exactly in line with the popular taste of poetry at the time. The United States had moved on from the sort of sing-song, Longfellow, Hiawatha era. The most popular poet at that time was a New Englander named Edwin Arlington Robinson. He won the Pulitzer Prize that year for one of his poems, which was not a rhyming poem. But the literary quality that I talked about even showed itself in minor news items, and there's a very fun one I found here. If you look on the right-hand side, there's a headline that says, "Goshawk and Owl Break into News." And this is, the story starts on Washington's birthday in the morning. This is from the March 3rd, 1927 paper. In the morning, Johnny and Henry Pickering, aged 10 and 7 years, rescued their pigeon from a hawk in an extraordinary manner. The boys were in their yard when a marauding goshawk swooped upon the pigeon and carried it off to a neighboring field. The Pickerings are a Carter Street family. Instantly, the boys were in pursuit in what appeared to be a hopeless chase. And what they did was they ran into a neighboring field, and they scared the goshawk off the ground, but it kept the pigeon in its talons, and it landed in a tree over a river. And Henry picked up a rock. And the story says, or Johnny rather picked up a rock. Johnny the elder seized a stone and hurled it with force inspired by grief for his pet and rage against the hawk. This is a front page story. David, using his bit of strength against Goliath, was imbued with no greater desire to hit his mark than was Johnny. The missile flew through the air and struck the hawk square in the head. The bird fell with the stone to the stream. The pigeon, released from the cruel clutch of the talons of the hawk, fluttered to the bank of the brook, frightened and badly bruised, but very much alive. And the story ends. I just thought this stuff was great. I mean, the story ends, the pigeon, at last reports, was able to sit up and take notice. While Johnny may be listed among the very few boys who have succeeded in rescuing a pet and putting, I don't even know how to say, hors de combat, a tough visitor from the northern wilds with a single shot, potting the proverbial two birds with the one stone. So this is just wonderful stuff, and it's in that spirit that we should read about New Canaan marking Lindbergh's accomplishment. You see the headline here, Lindbergh Pictures Rush to Town. And what this story is about those, the newsreels and photos that Terry mentioned. They made much of the fact that the photos were shown in town in the same day that they were taken. That was a big deal. Pictures taken after 2 o'clock in New York on Monday afternoon were shown on the screen in the Playhouse here that evening and were enthusiastically received by an audience which took practically every seat in the house. They came from a news service, and it's noted here that he arranged to have the Lindbergh celebration films shown here on every evening of the day they took place. Okay, so New Canaanites were marking Lindbergh's victory lap in real time, as it was then. And it ends, it was another proof of the progressive spirit of the management of the New Canaan Theater. Then you have the poem. Of course, you have a poem because it's 1927 and we write poems on the front page. This one's called Welcome Home, and this was dedicated to Lindbergh. I don't know who wrote it. They just had the initials, but the last initial was H, so it could have been one of the owner, Herson family. I don't know. It sort of goes like, "O Captain of the air, who keen and strong defieth the sun's fierce glare." I mean, it's really sort of overwrought poem. It goes on from there. It's June 16th, 1927, if you want to look it up. It's at the Historical Society. Back to the Pickerings for a moment. So these are our Pickerings, if you know the family. And I spoke to Fred about Johnny, the pigeon savior, and his brother Henry. Those are his uncles. Those are his dad's older brothers. Fred is our police lieutenant. He's been in the news recently. He was the cop who was dragged during the motor vehicle stop. He's okay. He's getting back. They lived on Carter Street. They had the first 3 houses on the left as you come off of 123. And the father of those boys was one of the first Pickerings to come to New Canaan. He was an ice delivery man. He would, by horse and buggy, get ice from Norwalk and deliver it to homes in New Canaan.
Okay, so segueing from ice. In the days before electric refrigeration, food was cooled by ice. My dad, who was born in 1941, still refers to it as the ice box. This Historical Society photo right here shows Monroe's Pond. It was owned by the Monroe family, and it was located right about where 123 crosses the 5 Mile River around Brushy Ridge Road, where Summer Street meets Locust, and where that intersection is. So ice is cut out and it's stored in an ice house. You can see the chute to the right. It was pulled up the chute, and then when it was delivered, it was sent down the chute. There's a famous scene in East of Eden with James Dean in an ice house at about the same era. But anyway, so yeah, so this was used for refrigeration. Electric refrigerators, just to sort of give you a sense of cost. In 1922, an electric refrigerator cost $700. That's almost twice as much as a 1922 Ford Model T. Oh, and to the right, this is an existing ice house on the lower right in New Canaan. This is on Weed Street, pretty much just across the street from Ash Tree Lane. So there's an ice pond and an ice house, and I don't know how much longer it has. That area is being developed, subdivided, or proposed to be subdivided and developed. Okay, so back to Railroad Avenue. At the time, around 1927, there was really nothing from.
This photo's later.
Yeah, this is much later. You can tell by the servicemen in the lower left corner. This is probably about 19, and by the cars, it's probably early 40s. And by this time, it had taken over the name Elm Street. The reason why it changed was because they felt that Railroad Avenue sort of indicated a bit of poverty. There are other municipalities where homes and businesses by the railroad were sort of like literally the other side of the tracks. So they renamed it Elm Street, keeping in line with Maple Street and Cherry Street and eventually Pine Street. But it was a little bit more, I guess, suburban. But before this picture was taken, there was really not many businesses past the Playhouse on the north side of the street until you got down to the corner where Brotherhood was and still is. But eventually, people would follow the Franco's lead. One of them is Patsy Totaro, who had a vegetable and fruit stand in a market on Main Street. He would move shortly after the Francos did to a building that was constructed across the street from the Playhouse at about 1930. It was called the Colonial. It's called the Colonial Building, and you can see it in the lower right corner. But that's Totaro's Market right there. And then to the right, you can see Lenny Paglialunga going up to Dunkin' Donuts.
No,
that's not Lenny Pags, but that's at the side of the building on top, which is a sister building to the Playhouse with replete with the cupola on top. That actually became the post office on Elm Street and served as a post office until the 50s. To the right, that's not the Colon. That's actually the Colonial Barber Shop. The Rucci family eventually owned that. For those of you who are longtime New Canaanites, the Rucci name is probably a very familiar one. Joe Rucci, the attorney in town, and his son David, who's also an attorney in town. And we went to center school with Josh Rucci. Which one? Oh, so despite the fact that businesses were kind of trickling, there was one very well-known family business that had made its way up into the boondocks towards the train depot. And Mike's going to talk about who that was.
Okay. Carl Chevrolet was founded in 1927. You may recall we had an ad here, showed in the lower left, the Help New Canaan ad campaign listed Carl Brothers as a local business. Carl Brothers started in 1914. It was the uncle, a guy called John Carl, uncle to Leo Jr., if you know Leo. He's still coming into the office, I guess. But this was, he was the oldest of 7 sons from Milford, and he came down around 1906 or 1908 and got a job as a chauffeur because he knew how to drive, and not many people did at that time. In talking to Leo Jr., learned that John, his uncle John, had that German ingenuity. His own father, that's John's, had come over at age 17 during the Civil War to the United States from Germany. And John had a reputation of being able to fix cars. And he got so busy that he gave up his chauffeur job and just fixed cars. Got busy enough doing that he sent up for a brother, and by the time they got through, all 7 of the Carl brothers had worked in the shop. They set up a Buick garage downtown New Canaan in 1914. Leo, Leo Carl, who we're looking at in the upper right there on his wedding day, was somewhere in the middle of those 7 brothers. He and another brother in 1927 had an opportunity to take over a Chevrolet dealership, which was not faring well, Charles Freeman's dealership. And Leo, with a younger brother, Emil, took it over, and on September 15th, 1927, launched Carl Chevrolet. In its first year, Carl Chevrolet sold 34 new and 38 used cars. That's Leo in the upper right. He let me take his photo the other day when he was talking to him. That business we talked about, the repair shop, was located in the middle of Elm Street, Railroad Avenue. When they vacated that spot, the McGrath Bus Company moved in. If anyone remembers that, it was next to where there was a 5 and 10 store, which we're showing here in the lower left. It's right about where South Avenue comes into Elm Street now. They moved up to where the Webster Bank used to be. That's a brick building opposite the entrance to the lumberyard lot. Some local people call it the Engel Building. They stayed at that location, and Leo and a younger brother came to the current location of Carl Chevrolet the following year, 1928. This is a map showing the plans for Carl Chevrolet. You can tell that's where it is because that's Grove Street. You can barely make it out in the lower left of the map. It was funny because in talking to Leo Jr., this site that they're on now had been a town highway garage, and when they put the showroom on that we know in 1977, they were sort of digging up a bunch of old stuff that had been buried in the ground, cuttings of old shoe leather and such. But the Carl's business had always been on some stretch of Railroad Avenue or Elm Street. And in fact, on the other side of the family, the Carls that we all know had come to New Canaan around the time of the Civil War. It was on Leo Jr.'s maternal grandfather's side. A man named Henry Kelly, who was a very prominent New Canaanite, was the son of the first man from that side of the family to move here, to Hoyt's Nursery, out by the Pickerings on Carter Street. Kelly, grandfather to Leo Jr., was born in Greenwich. He lived in one of the houses that the Help lived in on Hoyt's Nursery, and it was all Hoyt's property back there. The story has it that when he was a little boy, he was born 1861, his father took him to Norwalk train station, and they watched Lincoln go by on a train. Norwalk is a stop on the main line. He saw Abe Lincoln. That's one president we all know about. In Bryson's book, we also read about Calvin Coolidge. And this photo in the lower right, on the deck of a ship, we see Silent Cal sort of in the middle. He's standing from our perspective to the right of his wife, Grace, First Lady. Next to her is Henry Kelly. This photo at the bottom reads, "The President and Mrs. Coolidge and the American delegates to the conference on board the Texas after their arrival at Havana." This probably was from Coolidge's very well-known address before the Pan American Conference in January 1928. He was still president, though his time was winding down. And you and I have to move quickly. We'll probably just keep going more. Sorry about that. It was some really cool models of cars at the time, but we're sort of running short on time too.
So here's the Birdsall House. There are 3 great shots from the Historical Society. People would use those cars to travel up Route 1, Pre-Merritt Parkway, to New York City and into New Canaan, where they would stay many times at some of the many inns that New Canaan had in town. Birdsall House is right in the center of town on Main Street, where Morse Court is today. It was torn down for parking. So we'll cue Joni Mitchell. Some more inns. Mike mentioned the Bach family earlier. They were the owners of the Melba Inn, which you might remember, recently torn down. And again, another parking lot right by St. A's, the corner of Park and Cherry. Right next to it was the Ardsley Inn, which was, I'm told, owned by the Silliman family. You might remember Silliman's down on Forest Street, or corner of East Avenue in Forest, where the Athletic Shoe Factory is now. And then up on Owen there were a couple of great inns. One was the Maples, the Hampton, also known as the Hampton Inn, and of course our Roger Sherman, which is the last of all of those, still standing in New Canaan. Another attraction for New Canaan were people who were suffering from diseases of the lungs, tuberculosis. We all know about the Cure homes up in upstate New York, up at Saranac Lake in the Adirondacks. This is the Brooks home on South Avenue, the Brooks Sanatorium. And Dr. Myron Brooks was a longtime doctor in town. He was actually New Canaan's chief health officer and medical examiner, and had his practice curing diseases of the lungs in New Canaan till about 1929 when he retired. It's been a private residence ever since. It still stands, happily to say, on South Avenue. You'll know it's on the right-hand side, just past, I think, Mortimer Street, and at the corner of what is called Brooks Road, named after the good doctor. Okay, so meanwhile, just up South Avenue, in 1927, we saw the creation and founding of New Canaan High School. Kind of hard to believe, or hard to imagine a New Canaan without a New Canaan High School, but we didn't have one for a very long time. Up until that time, Stanford was the destination for people seeking continuing education. They would have to take a train to Stanford to take classes at Stanford High School. Stanford kind of forced our hand. They kicked us out. They said, we will not be accepting New Canaanites after 1926. So there's an advertisement right there on the upper left, and it says, when the New Canaan High School opens, new opportunities will be offered for the boys and girls of our town. The merchants and businessmen of New Canaan always will do their share toward cooperating in the future as they have in the past, with the school system, committee, superintendent, principal, faculty, and pupils. We know that as the school will help you, so you will help New Canaan. Businesses listed here included Carl Brothers, Walter Stewart's, the advertisers, Weed and Duryea. So there were 6 different locations that they were discussing to build the high school. The first vote, they decided to build it in Mead Park, because as I said before, Mead hadn't been fully realized and developed as we know it today. You had to kind of wait for the Great Depression for that to happen. They immediately rescinded that vote as they were given a parcel of land between Church and Oak Street, and that's where they built it. Police department today. Yeah. So they built the building that you see on the upper and lower corners. Immediately they had overcrowding, so it was actually 7th grade through 12th grade, so they sent 7th and 8th grade back to an already crowded center school. And Henry Kelly, who Mike talked about, he laid the cornerstone for the new New Canaan High School. I think you just saw it today, didn't you?
Yeah, that's the photos right there. You can see at the bottom there, they're sort of behind this green contraption, but you can still see the cornerstone of it's the police department now, the original New Canaan High School.
Yeah, so it's the police department now. Actually, on the northern side of the building, it said that was the entrance for boys. The southern side was for girls. The cops today process criminals the same way. Men are taken through the north. That's actually not true. Don't write that down. It's a little bit of revisionist history. So, all right. So they addressed the overcrowding pretty quickly. The building you see on the left, that's where was that shot taken? That was from the photo contest.
Yes, that's the I Love New Canaan. That's
Yeah.
Norman Jensen's photo.
Yeah, Norm Jensen's photo on the lower left. Beautiful shot of the junior high school. So they built that in 1931. So this sort of became a kind of a campus. Yeah, the junior high school on one side. It's now the schoolhouse apartments. For a time, it was the Board of Education. I remember being a kid running through those halls, eating Lorna Doones that Dottie Hutchinson would give me. And I haven't stopped eating the Lorna Doones. So anyway, that was New Canaan High School until 1956 when Saks opened. And then they moved across the street to the current high school in 1971. And so with the high school came varsity sports. That photo you see right there, again, another historical society photo, is the diamond where it currently is situated in Mead Park. This photo is actually from the 30s, I want to say, judging by the uniform and the fact that there's a grandstand. There used to not be a grandstand there. That was part of the WPA improvements to Mead Park during the Depression. So as I said, the founding of the high school meant the start of the baseball team. So this item from the April 21st, 1927 New Canaan Advertiser says, high school team scheduled to start. New Canaan High School will make its world premiere on the baseball diamond Wednesday afternoon when it will don the spangles on the Darien High School field near the new high school building in Darien, which is, I think, Darien Town Hall. The locals have been practicing for the past 2 weeks and declare they will have little trouble disposing of the Darien aggregation, even though the latter has been working out for 5 weeks. The high school team may as well get its work while it can, because some of the old-time players in town began yesterday to feel spring get into their muscles, which we're all waiting to do. Stop. And some may feel it necessary to get a baseball game out of their system before long. L.P. Frothingham, whose reputation as a pitcher helped make New Canaan famous as a national pastime town not so many years ago, is among those who believe the old soup bone is still good enough to keep the pill away from the high school player. Yeah, the pill is the ball. And we have a great reporter from the Stanford Advocate who's sitting back there, Scotty Erickson. He can help translate some of this. Ultimately, that first game against Darien was a rainout, and it wasn't Steve Banco's fault. And when New Canaan did play Darien, we learned from the June 3rd paper that the local team lost, 22-7. Oh. This was baseball. This was not a football score.
You should just wrap it up. Yeah, go ahead. Okay. Actually, you want to do this one? No. Okay. Yeah, we're running a little bit behind, so I'm just going to wrap up the last 2 slides we have here kind of quickly. There were some other notes I wanted to make for those of us who read and enjoyed the great Bryson book that the library selected. On the left, this is Florence Harding, First Lady and wife of Warren Harding, who was president for a very short period of time in the 20s. And just a side note, her mother, Louise Boughton King, was a New Canaan native, mother-in-law to the president. We also have Gutzon Borglum, the sculptor who designed and oversaw the work on Mount Rushmore. We have descendants of Mr. Borglum, or New Canaan residents, as it turns out. And one is a standout member of our Kiwanis Club, David. And on the bottom, we have Maxwell Perkins, the great editor of Scribner's, who edited Hemingway and Fitzgerald and introduced some of the great expatriate writers. He lived in that prominent Greek revival on Park Street, owned by Mr. Bergman. He lived there from 1924 to 1947, did Perkins. So in closing, I want to thank my brother Terry for doing most and almost all the heavy lifting here. A special thanks to the Franco, Carl, and Stewart families for your photo contributions and giving of your time. A very special thanks to the New Canaan Historical Society. On Thursday, there's a gallery opening upstairs here, which looks terrific. It's at 6. After that, up the hill at the Historical Society at 7 is a Cracker Barrel, which is sort of people sit around and swap old stories. Jim Bach, we've mentioned, will be there. The inimitable Ed Krostowski will be there. It's sort of a living history, and that's going to be at 7 o'clock. And then I just want to say about the Historical Society, this was quite a specific thing to ask them to help me research 1927, and they could not have been more accommodating and expert in their advice. So thank you again to them. And there might be an article on all of this in tomorrow's New Canaanite. I just have to figure out, there's something happening that just broke before this, but so there might be an article on that, or there might be an article about something really interesting. Okay. Okay.
That's it. Thank you.
Thank you guys so much. This was just the most fabulous event, and I'm so glad that you would agree to be a part of it with us. Michael and Terry were the earliest readers of the book when we first decided to get this book, and I passed a couple of copies on to Mike and said, here's what we're going to read this year. I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff here, and from that came the idea that became tonight. So thanks so much, guys. It was really great. I really enjoyed it.